So as we continue our investigation of evolution, now that we have a basic idea of what it involves, let's talk about the mechanisms. How does genetic change in a population happen over time? Can we quantify that? Can we study that? Can we look at trends in that? So again, evolution, genetic change in a population over time. Remember, populations evolve, individuals just adapt. And natural selection is going to show us that those individuals with the greatest reproductive success in their current environment will pass on their genes to a greater extent than those that aren't as well adapted, right? So the selective pressure will dictate which genes provide the greatest reproductive success. So when we look at natural selection, we can look at a situation or an example of three different types of selection: stabilizing, directional, and diversifying selection. And what we're going to do is look at an example of these tiny desert mice. And these desert mice are going to have survival fitness based on their ability to camouflage themselves against their background. So if we start with a very diverse population, in this sense, where is it going to go based on the environment? If the environment is very stable, what we're going to see is that those mice that are closest to the color of their background, say this dirt, are going to survive the most, because the hawks don't see them as well, and they're going to see the mice that are lighter and darker because there's greater contrast with the background. And we'll see what's called stabilizing selection. We're going to push towards the mean, or the most, in this case, the most appropriate one, and lose the extremes. All right. So stabilizing selection is what you see when you have a stable environment and we move towards the mean. Now, directional selection is probably most common as it's going on, whether towards one extreme or the other. But because the environment is often changing, or you have populations that are moving, they're migrating. Let's say there was an area that these mice were inhabiting, and then all of a sudden there was a flood or a shift, and a river now covers where they were. So they have to move to a new piece of land. And that land happens to be darker. So all of a sudden now we're selecting for only the darkest colored mice. And so we see a directional selection towards one extreme. So stabilizing selection, directional selection, new environments, and then finally diversifying selection, which is what we're going to see in a patchwork environment, or a change in the environment that results in two optimals. So in this case, you might see an area where you have dark rocks and light sand. And the mice that live there, the population, those mice that are light, as long as they stay on the light sand, they're well protected. The dark mice, as long as they stay on the dark rocks, are well protected. Good camouflage. But if you're in the middle, you've got nowhere to hide. You're too dark for the light sand and you're too light for the dark rock, so you're going to get picked off and eaten. And if you're dead, you can't reproduce. This is kind of the start of an example of what would lead to speciation. Ultimately, if these light mice and dark mice never got to breed together, you could see them change so much genetically over a long period of time that they couldn't breed together anymore, and that would constitute a new species. But we'll talk about the idea of species and speciation just a little bit later. Now, all this is based on natural selection. This says if you have genes that give you a phenotype that allows you to survive and, more specifically, reproduce better, those genes will be passed on more. Okay? And that is kind of the main force behind evolution. But it's not the only force. Now, we're also going to see what's called genetic drift. So genetic drift is changes in the genes of a population, not based on natural selection, but based on random chance. So, for example, if you've got a pile of beetles here, that, there's diversity in their shell color, what have you. Brown may be good, green may be good. Hasn't been selected for yet. And then someone comes along and just happens by chance to step on most of the green beetles, and they're dead. You've just changed the genetic component. The gene pool is significantly different now. The allele frequency of the green shell has gone way, way down, not because of natural selection, but because of random chance. Usually we think about these as like a natural disaster, catastrophe, landslide, or a volcano, or an earthquake or something, where you just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and you're wiped out. It had nothing to do with your genes. So let's look at a example of that using this jar analogy. So if we look at the original population, you can see the alleles in this original population. There's the blues and the whites and the yellows, right? And then some natural event happens, and we call this a bottleneck effect. So when you have a drastic reduction in a population, only the alleles that happen to survive, and it has nothing to do with their genes, but just by chance, will now be the new gene pool. So you have this volcano erupt on an island, and you wipe out most of each population, and those few survivors just happen to be in the right place to be protected, not anything to do with their genes. Now we've gone from lots of blues and whites and yellows to no yellows, mostly blue and one white in that surviving population. So the bottleneck effect can drastically change the gene pool, and it's genetic drift, right? Because when we're drifting, we don't have any control. And so this is independent of natural selection. This is random chance. Now, very, very similar, basically the same effect can be described as the founder effect. And this is when you have a few individuals who start a new population. They only bring with them the alleles they have. So again, much like Darwin's finches, if you have a small group of a larger population blown, in this case by a storm or something, into an isolated environment, they only have those alleles that they brought with them. It's not necessarily representative of the larger population of that species. But as they start to reproduce in their new environment, they again are restricted to those alleles. They've changed the gene pool significantly. So this is much like the bottleneck effect, except that the isolation factor going to start a new population is what we call the founder effect. Now, another component of genetic drift is gene flow. And so again, let's look at two isolated populations, population A and population B. And so population A lives in an environment where they are homozygous for this H. So let's say they're blue. And population B is in an environment where it's selected for homozygous recessive H, little h, so they're red. But, things happen, like, again, not because of any particular genetic behavior or trait, but birds fly a little too far, or there's a storm, or they get lost, or someone captures them and releases them on the other side of the mountain. All of a sudden, they bring with them a new allele, right? So if they breed, if they're fertile and they breed with a new population that they've immigrated to, we've introduced a new allele, right? So gene flow is immigration and emigration of fertile individuals to and from populations, right? So this is, again, these are not huge effects necessarily, but they are there, and an introduction of a new allele can have an impact if that allele is selected for then by natural selection. Now, the final component of gene flow is, again, random chance, and then it's the loss of an allele due to meiosis. Okay, so small populations are particularly vulnerable to allele loss from genetic drift, because if we do our Punnett square, let's say we've got a very small population and there's only one yellow pea plant. So these are like pea pods. There's only one yellow pea plot in this population. And so we're vulnerable to lose the yellow gene. Let's say the yellow breeds with a green, because there's only greens around to breed with. And you can see here, based on this Punnett square, that 50% of their kids are going to be green. Now, the other way to say that is that every time they have a child, every time they make baby pea plants, there's a 50% chance that they'll be yellow and a 50% chance that they'll be green. Now, if you flip a coin, it's not inconceivable to get heads 3 or 4 times in a row. And if these two individuals, if the yellow individual only ends up having green babies, only passing on the small y, the green gene in this case, just because of random chance, then you could potentially lose that yellow allele, that dominant yellow allele. All right. So again, genetic drift is changes in a population not due to natural selection, but due to random chance, but it's still evolution because it's change in a population over time. Natural selection is still our major force in evolution, and so these are smaller effects, but still significant.